So this is going to be, I guess you can call it session number 2 in our review of and discussion on the book by Daniel Rogers, The Last Enemy and the Triumph of Christ. If you haven't seen part 1, then I recommend you go to part 1 and have a look there so you can kind of be up to speed as to where we're going to go into now. We're going to start on page 21, entitled By Man Came Death. Now, I'd like to start by saying that we identified in the first part that physical death was a part of the creation. Well, man didn't do the creation. That was the Father. So if by man came death, and physical death was not the death that man brought about, then what death was it? So here we're going to see. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the verses that are called out here in these chapters, and we're going to discuss a little bit of context and information surrounding the verses as suggested by the author. But if at any point in time anyone wants to go deeper into the surrounding text of the verses, then please stop me, and we can do that because I do have all of them here on the screen so that I can access them quickly instead of flipping through the book. So the very first scriptural reference here is Romans 5:12. And it's, so I've copied, let me start at 5:12. Let's see. I'll start at verse 10. For if, being enemies, we were restored to favor with Elohim through the death of his Son, much more, having been restored to favor, we shall be saved by his life. And not only this, but we also exult in Elohim through our Master Yahushua Mashiach, through whom we have now received the restoration to favor. For this reason, even as through one man sin did enter into the world, and death through sin, and thus death spread to all men because all sinned. For until Torah, sin was in the world, but sin is not reckoned when there is no Torah. And so that's the reference there is verse 12. For this reason, even as through one man sin entered into the world, and death through sin, and thus death spread to all men because all sinned. The author is just emphasizing that sin entered the world through man, and death through sin. So the next reference is 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 20 and 21. And for this one, it's, let's see, 1 Corinthians, now there's 58 verses in this chapter. They're not very long verses, but I'll start at 20. I'll go from 20 to 23 so we kind of get the idea that the author is trying to paint the picture of. Now, again, this is one of Paul's writings, so just as Romans was, it's just he's writing to, but the one thing that I would consider for everyone looking at these different letters that Paul wrote to these different groups of people is that he doesn't say the same things in the same way. But one way we can kind of verify what's being said is that he contextually seems to be speaking to the audience in a way they can understand it. So when we consider who he's writing to, then it kind of helps a little bit more, even though it is all mostly Paul. So an example of that, if I wrote a letter to Kay, it'd probably be a little bit different than if I wrote a letter to George. My language would be a little different because we can relate differently. You see, and so in the same way, Paul has done this with the Romans or the Corinthians or the Ephesians or other people that he wrote to. So it still does have value, I think, but it is a good point that most of these are from Paul. So 1 Corinthians 15, starting in verse 20, actually starting in verse 18. Then also those who have fallen asleep in Messiah have perished. If in this life only we have expectation in Messiah, we are of all men the most wretched. But now Messiah has been raised from the dead and has become the first fruit of those having fallen asleep. Now I want to stop right there and point out something. We already know that the first physical resurrection was not Yahushua that we have in scriptures. We've got Lazarus. We've got the girl that died. We've got the several other examples of people who were physically dead, who were resurrected, and life was restored to their body. But the Messiah here is called the first of first fruit, become the first fruit of those having fallen asleep. Just a side note, that's my note. For since death is through a man, resurrection of the dead is also through a man. Again, emphasis on the man. Not God in the flesh of man, but man. For as all die in Adam, so also all shall be made alive in Mashiach. And each in his own order. Messiah, the first fruits, then those who are of Messiah at his coming. And then the end, when he delivers up the reign to Elohim the Father, when he has brought to naught all rule and all authority and power. So, and then it goes on to say the last enemy to be brought to naught is death. And that will come up again later. So, death came by man. However, what is the nature of this death? From our study, we have shown that it is spiritual death, but let's take a look at these events in the book of Genesis to get further insight into these matters. After Yah created man, he gave him several commands. And this, the fruit of this can be found in Genesis chapter 2, verses 16 and 17. These commands that were given to man in the garden. And Yahuwah Elohim commanded the man, saying, eat of every tree of the garden, but do not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. For in the day you eat of it, you shall certainly die. This command was broken in the next chapter, but we'll examine that later in our study. So the author breaks these verses down. And number 1, he says, of every tree of the garden you may freely eat. Number 2, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die. So, then there's a bunch of discussion about something that we covered in the last section, or the last segment, was what is the consequence of sin? And we already kind of established that. Does anyone remember what the consequence of sin is?
Is it separation from God?
Right. Yeah, that would be, yes, I agree. And that's also defined as spiritual death, right?
Right.
So,
Yeah.
So the author also makes a good point here. Adam and Eve had permission to eat of every tree. And by the way, what would happen if they abstained from getting nutrients through consuming food? There was one tree, however, that they were not allowed to eat of, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The eating of this tree was strictly forbidden and had dire consequences. So then there's a good point here. You would correctly acknowledge the fact that putting your hand into a beehive would directly result in being stung. So he's making a point that if I tell you that in the day you stick your hand in a beehive, you'll be stung, what would you mean? What would you think that means? It's right now. So he also goes on to say, we know that they were sure, as point 6 illustrates. God said, in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die. And then they ask the question, did Adam die physically in the day that he ate of the fruit? Remember that the definition of physical death is the state of which a soul is separate from the body. Beginning to physically die or starting towards physical death, both do not answer the requirements of Yah's law that was sure. If Adam didn't physically die in the day that he ate of the fruit, isn't it obvious that his sin produced spiritual death? So now we're moving on to Genesis chapter 3. Was the devil right? And that's an interesting question, because if the Father says you'll surely die, and Satan says you surely will not die, and then you do not die, then who was telling the truth and who was telling the lie? You see, so there's something else going on here. There has to be.
Michael, what would you say to someone who said maybe they didn't die right when they ate that fruit, but that was the day that they began to die, because from that point on, their physical body was not being sustained anymore. And that's, I mean, their physical body, let's see, before they had some eternal body or something, I don't know. I'm just trying to think of different ways that people try to explain this by saying that, no, he didn't fall down dead right then, but he was cast from the garden. He couldn't eat from the tree of life anymore. So the consequence was that, because as soon as you're born, your body's already starting to die, right? And then the older you get, those things are shutting down. But so you could say that death started then.
You could, but here's my here's my thinking on that. This is one of many of my thoughts. I filtered through all of them for your convenience, and I'm just going to tell you a little bit of them.
Okay.
So most everyone, no matter whether they say that the death began there or not, most everyone would certainly agree that there was a spiritual death that occurred that day. Otherwise, there was a lie told by the Creator, and we know that's not the truth. But in addition to what we covered in the first segment, I would direct them to that video, and I would also state, how many times did the Father say they would die? And how many times did the Messiah say that every man must die?
What video are you talking about?
Huh?
What video?
The one we recorded last Shabbat.
Oh, okay.
It is, every man must die once. Once. And that's not any different from Adam. Okay, so Adam was told in the garden, in the day you eat of it, you will surely die. Not you will surely die twice. Not you will surely die spiritually now and then physically later. Not you will surely begin to die. And it doesn't matter what language you break it down in, it doesn't say that. And so I can certainly understand the conclusion or the idea that that supports the doctrine of the physical death began there. But if physical death was already a part of creation, then how can we say that it began there? When the seed bears its, when the seed blossoms and becomes a tree and bears fruit, death has to occur in order for that life to abound. When a man and a woman reproduce, death has to occur for the life to abound. Death was already a part of the creation. It did not
So
start.
you're saying that Adam and Eve didn't have eternal bodies? That they were eating from the tree of life and they were going to live forever? I don't know. I'm just asking questions here.
So,
Because I guess my thought has always been, oh, they would have lived forever if they hadn't eaten from that fruit.
and that's always been my thought.
But what you're saying is that's not true, right? Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that I'm not certain, but I am highly in favor of the idea that they were not created to be immortal forever in that body that they were in. I don't think that was the point of the creation. I think that, and I don't know all the details of that, but I do know that I used to believe that they were created in the garden, and if they would have just done the right thing, then they'd still be there today.
It'd be just like heaven, right?
Yeah, we'd all be in the garden hanging out, eating berries, and being naked, just hanging out, not even knowing. But I don't really think that's I don't think that's the case. I think I was mistaken in that belief. And I think that what this lesson is uncovering for me is the quite honestly the nature of the creation and what happened, what actually happened, and because in order to defeat your enemy, you have to identify your enemy. And up until this lesson, not this particular book, but this idea and this thought process, I wasn't real clear Well, I thought I was clear on what death was and what life was and what resurrection even was. But I don't see it as physical anymore, because here's the thing. If you read the book of Hebrews and you hear that there was an old covenant, there was an old way through Moses, which did not bring the life and did not bring forth the forever kind of restoration that the Father wanted. But there was and if that did do it, then the Messiah wouldn't have to come through another priesthood, that he could have just came through the Levites and it would have been okay. And I'm paraphrasing, of course. But then the better promises are clearly spiritual, because they never end. They are forever, and the reign of Messiah is forever. It never ends. Everything that's physical passes away. Everything. But the spiritual is forever. So by very design, every single thing that is tangible that we can touch, it has an expiration date.
Adam and Eve, if they had been living for many years in the garden in that perfect state, they would have been seeing these things dying, do you think?
I can almost guarantee.
They would have seen like the trees, the seeds falling into the ground and reproducing more and all of that. There wasn't like perpetual living trees.
I would think they would have to, because we had rivers that flowed, we had trees that produced seeds, we had fruit. So when you eat the fruit dies, right? You have a seed that comes, and there's death, because the plants are alive and you're eating the plants and you're killing them. There is death in the garden. But death, so physical death is not a bad guy. He gets a bad rap, and they gave him a little thing with a reaper. You know, that's not death. That's crazy stuff. So I think that the very first thing that needs to happen in anybody's mind, well, for one, is prayer and a contrite heart. But the most important thing in this whole topic is identifying physical death. And what is it? And is it bad? Because in our culture, physical death is horrible. We hate it. We can't stand it. Everybody's trying to escape it. But the truth is, nobody gets out of here alive, right? I think Jim Morrison said that.
Enoch.
And so the focus then should not be trying to preserve our physical bodies forever, but to live a life according to the teachings of the Messiah and the words of the Father, which are both in sync with one another, so that we can have a better promise, which is what we do have if we live that way. And so I'm not sure if I answered your question, but that's I guess my long answer. So let's see.
Thank you, Michael.
Welcome. There's no quick cut answer, because usually every little short answer leads to another question.
Yeah.
All right, so where am I? So I'm going to go on to Genesis chapter 3, verses 1 through 5. We're in the section now, was the devil right? So, and the Nahash was more crafty, or serpent was more crafty than all the lives of the field which Yahuwah Elohim had made. He said to the woman, is it true that Elohim has said, do not eat of every tree of the garden? And the woman said to the Nahash, we are to eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, Elohim has said, do not eat of it, nor touch it, lest you die. And the Nahash said to the woman, you shall certainly not die, for Elohim knows that in the day you eat of it, your eyes shall be opened, and you shall be like Elohim, knowing good and evil. And the woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was pleasant to the eyes, and the tree desirable to make one wise, and she took of its fruit and ate. She also gave her husband with her, and he ate. So so we have two contrary arguments. You will die, you won't die. So you will not surely die, said the devil, and they didn't physically die for hundreds of years. If if some people's idea of the death that Adam brought in is true, then God was wrong and the father of all lies was correct. However, if we allow God to establish the timeline and the nature of the punishment, then Satan was truly wrong and God, as his nature is, was correct. And there's a diagram in the book with a calendar to kind of simplify it even more, but I don't think we need to do that. So I think that was a good point too that kind of answered the question too, Kelly. In another way. So, another point in Genesis 3, the day Adam ate and died. Now, this point is another good point along the same line. The day Adam ate and died. What is sin, first of all? And now I've always, since I came out of Christianity through the Hebrew roots and all this stuff, I've learned that what is sin? Well, the first answer is, who knows the first answer, what is sin?
Missing the mark.
Okay, that's a great one.
Probably not your first thought.
No, well, my first thought
Anything
now.
against Torah?
Well, from years of learning Torah and all that stuff, when I hear sin, I just think transgression of Torah, right? Transgression of law. Really simplified us going against his instructions. But there's actually more than that definition in scriptures about what sin is. And they're not just found in Paul's writings. They're found in 1 John, they're found in James, and they're found in Romans. So did Adam sin? Well, in Romans 14, verses 20 through 23, but focused on verse 23, do not destroy the work of Elohim for the sake of food. All indeed are clean, but evil to that man who eats so as to cause stumbling. It is good not to eat meat or drink wine, nor to do whatever by which your brother stumbles. Do you have belief? Have it to yourselves before Elohim. Blessed is he who does not condemn himself in what he approves. But he who doubts if he eats is condemned, because it is not of belief, and all that is not of belief is sin. There's one definition. Now in 1 John chapter 3, verse 4, everyone do, and these are just quick references, so you don't have to turn there or anything, but 1 John chapter 3, verse 4, everyone doing sin also does lawlessness, and sin is lawlessness. So that's the one that I'm familiar with. Now 1 John 5:17 states, all unrighteousness is sin, and there is a sin not unto death. So there is a sin not unto death, but all unrighteousness is sin. And then the author misquoted this one. He put 1 John 4:17, but it's actually James 4:17. And that's on page 25 if you want to make a note in your books. And again, here's a plug for Daniel Rogers. The book is The Last Enemy and the Triumph of Christ. It's a fascinating book. I highly recommend it. So in the just below the section with the 1 through 4, there's a reference to 1 John 4:17. It's actually James 4:17, and it reads, "To him then who knows to good and does not do it, to him it is sin." So we have to ask ourselves a question now after reading all these definitions of sin. Was Adam guilty of sin? Did he sin? And I think it's a resounding yes, he did sin. So that came with a consequence. The wage of sin is death. So in Romans chapter 6:23, we see chapter 6, verse 23, and I'll start in verse 19. I speak as a man because of the weakness of your flesh, for even as you did present your members as servants of uncleanness and of lawlessness resulting in lawlessness, now so present your members as servants of righteousness resulting in set apartness. For when you were servants of sin, you were free from righteousness. What fruit, therefore, were you having then over which you are now ashamed? For the end thereof is death. But now, having been set free from sin, and having become servants of Elohim, or God, you have your fruit resulting in set apartness, and the end everlasting life. For the wages of sin is death, but the favorable gift of Elohim is everlasting life in Mashiach Yehusha, our Master. Now, secondly, we can examine the concept of the knowledge of good and evil and determine if Adam and Eve were guilty of sin. Now, whenever the Israelites were traveling toward the Promised Land, sin caused an entire generation of people to miss out on the ability to enter the land. If you remember, Joshua and Caleb were the only ones that could cross over into the Promised Land, right? With the exception, there were also the children. In these scriptures in Romans chapter 8, verses 12 through 14, we get an idea as to why the children were allowed to cross over with Joshua and Caleb. Now, Joshua and Caleb, they had trust in the Father, and they believed in his power. So they were granted the privilege to cross over, the blessing. But the children, it says in Romans chapter 8, verses 12 through 14, so then, brothers, we are not debtors to the flesh to live according to the flesh. For if you live according to the flesh, you're going to die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you shall live. For as many as are led by the Spirit of Elohim, these are sons of Elohim. So that is... Oh, that was my note relating to the top one. I had it in blue and I forgot why. I'm sorry, I apologize. That was my note because the author didn't seem to reference that scripture, but I thought it was relevant to the previous verses.
What is that, Michael? Can you say the source again, please?
Romans chapter 8, verses 12 through 14. In the scriptures, there's a reference to that verse, or to actually Romans chapter 8, verse 13, in verse 23 of chapter 6. And I read it, and I had to put it in here because it's talking about living to the Spirit and living and not dying. So, and it's really interesting because it says that we are not debtors to the flesh to live according to the flesh. And if you live according to the flesh, if you live carnally, if you put your flesh desires, temptations, or whatever have you at the forefront of your mind and you live according to your emotions and all those things, you're going to die. Now, everybody's going to die no matter what they do, a physical death, right? So why the warning that if you do these things, you're going to die? Does that mean that if you don't do these things, you're not going to physically die? No, it's not physical death that's being talked about here. It can't be. So if you live carnally, you're going to die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you shall live. For as many as are led by the Spirit, these are sons of Elohim. So that was a reference for me. Sorry about that. So now on to what I was talking about before with Joshua and Caleb. Sin, this is number 2 in the list here. Sin and the knowledge of good and evil. Deuteronomy chapter 1, verses 35 through 39, and I'll begin in 34. And Yahuwah heard the voice of your words and was wroth, and took an oath, saying, not one of these men of this evil generation shall see that good land of which I swore to give to your fathers, except Caleb, son of Jephunneh, he shall see it, and to allow him and his children I give the land on which he walked, because he followed Yahuwah completely. And Yahuwah was enraged with me for your sakes, saying, you do not go in there either. Yahusha, the son of Nun, who stands before you, he shall go in there. Strengthen him, for he shall cause Israel to inherit. And your little ones and your children, who you say are for a prey, who today have no knowledge of good and evil, they are going in there. And to them I give it, and they are to possess it. But you turn and take your journey into the wilderness by the way of the Sea of Reeds. So what stood out to you guys in that? Why did the children get to go in?
Was that Deuteronomy 1 that you were reading?
Yes, ma'am. I read 34 to 39 is what I just read.
Because they have no knowledge of good and evil.
That's what I'm thinking.
So that would is that like an expression saying that they were innocent? Would that be correct?
I think it could be. It could be.
According to your definition, it wouldn't be sort of that they weren't spiritually dead? Was he saying the rest were spiritually dead because of one act? I mean, couldn't they have been restored? It seems like you can't just make a blanket statement. They didn't go in because they were part of the group that didn't believe in that one moment. But in those 40 years, there could have been some transformation, right? They could have repented and had been restored to a right relationship with the Father.
There could have been, but I think what we're doing now is just dealing with what we have in the text, because we don't have that in the text. We don't know that. But it's possible. I think it is possible. But I think that at least the point of the book here, the Deuteronomy in this section, I think the point of it is emphasizing the faith that we're supposed to have, and the faith that, and by having doubt, allowing doubt to creep in and take over your thoughts and consume you, it leads to death.
Also, like I'm thinking this has something to do with accountability, because only those who are 20 and above, right? That generation, they were the ones who were not allowed to enter the promised land. And so when instruction was given to them to enter and take over the land, and Father explained to them, like, this land is flowing with milk and honey and all that, and this is really good for you. This is your inheritance. I'm giving it to you. It's like he expected them to believe him, to trust him, and to obey. And because they are of a certain like level of accountability already, and he even gave them the favor of allowing them to scout the land, look at it and see if I'm right. And they have proven him right. But after that, they allowed fear of something else, not just the Father's fear of something else, fear of the enemies perhaps, to creep into their minds, and that kind of hindered them from moving forward, from obeying the Father. So Father took that seriously because he has given them so many like allowances from the time the plagues in Egypt, the parting of the Red Sea. I mean, he has proven himself to these people who are adults supposedly, and still they were on the last step to getting their reward, and they hesitated. So I think the Father, I mean, it was not just hesitated, but they were rebelling against what he wanted to give them. So that was a big deal. It was not like, I don't think it was a small thing. But the thing is, they were not able to cross to the promised land, but 40 years again, I see the Father's mercy here, giving them a chance to transform and repent. And that was a good point, Kelly. And I think I wouldn't be surprised if there were many who repented. But still, we have a rule in the house, like with our children, like if you do something wrong, you have to be willing and accepting the consequences of your action, willing to submit to discipline. So probably these people, they were being disciplined and they have repented, but like even with Moses, he wasn't able to cross over. And we think, oh, it was just a small thing. But maybe there are things that we don't understand that's not explained really in the text. But he was able to live, given a chance, 40 years to repent. So maybe it's not a spiritual thing. Probably they were reconciled spiritually with the Father in that 40 years. They were just not able to get the physical reward. That's what I'm thinking.
That is a good point, that he was gracious to them to give them those 40 years. He just didn't kill them right then.
Yeah,
but they still suffered the consequences of their actions. So yes, I'm going to be gracious. I'm going to give you 40 more years to live, and time to think about what really happened here, because obviously they still had a lot of Egypt in them, and they couldn't get out of that. So they had those 40 years to work on that. But also there were consequences. They had to suffer the consequences of not believing at the time that they should have.
And I'm thinking they might have raised their children differently this time, like having repented in the wilderness, and then they taught their children, okay, so this is what I'm getting for being rebellious. Don't be like that. Don't be like me. Don't do what I did.
Yeah, so when you actually do go back to the land, don't do what we did.
That was very well put, Kay. Thank you. Kelly, do you always have the good questions? So what the author has to say here about that is their lack of knowledge of good and evil meant that they were not guilty of the sins that the covenant community had to endure together because of their collective unfaithfulness. Adam and Hawa lacked the knowledge of good and evil as well. However, there was a command delivered unto them, and they understood what that command was and the consequences of it, as seen in Genesis 3. And so that's great the way Kay put that, because Adam and Hawa, they didn't know knowledge of good and evil, but they understood what was told to them, and they knew the consequence. Whether they understood what it fully meant, I can't say that. But so the author goes on and mentions Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 15. Moses said, "See, I have set before you today life and good, death and evil." And let me see what I have in my notes for that. Okay, Adam and Hawa were given the same choice, and they chose death, though they did not have a broad knowledge of good and evil at the time of their sin. So they chose death, and we have to also choose life or death. And it's possible for us to be walking and breathing and living and talking and eat, drink, and be merry and still be dead at that time. And we've seen that, and that's not what we want. So now we have in section 3 of this piece is speaking on lust. All right, and lust clearly existed before the fall, and it didn't come as a result of sin. Lust was actually one of the things used to bring about the sin. We have always been free moral agents. We have never been robots, ever. It's always been free will from the first moment of creation. John 3:16 Everybody knows John 3:16. It's the most popular, probably, verse in the whole Bible, especially in the Western world. But what it points out is that salvation is offered to whoever will. So let me go there real fast. For
Maybe the most popular verse, but it's also the most misunderstood verse, I think, too, because they put it out differently.
I think you're right, Niels. I think you're right. And I don't have this in my notes, but I'm going to read it from the Pure Word translation, because it's really interesting to me the way they rendered it. Take an extra minute just to get there. Because God has loved in such a manner, and they translated, and I'm not sure about this, anytime it says world, they translated the Satan's world, and I kind of think I know what that means, but because there's references to who's the God of this world and all that stuff, and they're just trying to point out that it's not the world that he intended, but the actual carnal world, I think is what they mean to say. Because God has loved in such a manner the carnal world, because he loved us even when we were yet sinners, right? So that he gave his Son, the only begotten risen Christ, in order that whosoever is continuously by his choice, there's that free will, committing for the result and purpose of him, should not perish, but definitely should by his choice be continuously having eternal life. Now, that's kind of busy, that translation. But now if I read it from just the scriptures version, it still means the same thing. It's just not as filled. For Elohim so loved the world that he gave his only brought forth Son, so that everyone who believes in him should not perish but possess everlasting life. So that
Michael, in the Pure Word, it said something to the effect, whoever is continuously doing something rather than whoever believes.
Yeah, well, because belief, the word belief is really, really watered down, I think, in our culture. Because for me,
that's what we do. We say all you have to do is just pray this prayer and believe. It's just
right.
a one moment thing that happens, and then that's it. But that was a big difference that I saw in that translation.
And I agree with you, and I think that's why I like it so much, because it puts accountability on the individual. Because we are accountable to do something. And it doesn't mean that you have to learn all the 600 and something laws and do them all perfectly, properly, just right before you can have this, whatever it is. But what it does mean is that you have free will every single moment, every single day. And if you choose him, if you believe in him, that doesn't mean that you just think that he's real and that you think that what happened has really happened. No, that's not belief. Because even the demons believe and they shudder, right? In that sense. But it actually is an action word. It's a verb. It requires a change on your behalf. And so if I believe, right, if I believe that by eating this pill that it's going to kill me, I'm probably not going to eat the pill, right? Because I'm going to die. So that's the kind of belief we're talking about. We're talking belief that encourages action, and the action demonstrated is evidence of your belief, not only for you but to others around you. So if belief has no evidence, then it's not belief at all. So it can't just be in your head. It has to be out in the world. All right, so that was that's everyone who wills, who has the will, who actually believes, in the real sense of the biblical meaning of believes in him, should not perish but possess everlasting life. Now, Genesis 3:6 discusses Adam and Eve's lust. Verse 6, and the woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree desirable to make one wise. And she took of its fruit and ate. And she also gave to her husband with her, and he ate. Now she was tempted, and she was that her lust overcame her, and she ate. In 1 John, these are just mentions of lust, right? In 1 John 2:16, he explains the lust. He explains in detail different types of lust. Starting in verse 15, 1 John chapter 2, verse 15 through 17, do not love the world, nor that which is in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. Because all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, is not of the Father, but is of the world. And the world passes away, and the lust of it, but the one doing the desires of Elohim remains forever. Now this right here, these three verses together, what I used to think that means is the whole world's going to pass away. But I don't think that's what it means, because here, if you look at what he's saying, do not love the world, nor that which is in the world, and then he goes on to describe what he's talking about. He's not talking about the trees and the ground and all that stuff. No, he's talking about carnal living, the carnal mind, the carnal sensational living. Do not chase after emotional, sensational, lusty things, because all those things pass away. But the one doing the desires of Elohim lives forever. So I think that's a good reference that the author put in there. And then in James chapter 1, verse 13 through 15, we hear about temptation. Let no one say when he is enticed, I am enticed by Elohim. For Elohim is not enticed by evil matters, and he entices no one. But each one is enticed when he is drawn away by his own desires and trapped. Then, when desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. And sin, when it has been accomplished, brings forth death. Now, again, everyone here has sinned, right? Everybody here has sinned or has thought of something bad, and right? But we're still alive, right? Yeah, we're going to die. We're all going to die physically, but that sin brings forth death. Now, I'll venture to say that every moment when we choose not to sin, we are then dead to sin and we live to Elohim. We're dead to one or the other all the time. And we have to make the choice what we're dead to and what we're alive to. And whatever we're alive to, that is our master. Whatever we're dead to knows us not. So number 4, we talk about in Genesis chapter 3, separation from Yah, or death, or spiritual death. So in Genesis chapter 3, verse 22 and 23, and I'm going to go on through 24, and I'm trying to go through it pretty good so we can get through it. We're almost about to wrap it up here, but we may have to carry on for next week because I just noticed we're just over the hour. So I'm going to finish up these 4 points, and then we can pick up on it another time, or we can make a decision after that. And Yahuwah Elohim said, see, the man has become like one of us, to know good and evil. And now lest he put out his hand and take also the tree of life, and eat and live forever. So Yahuwah Elohim sent him out of the Garden of Eden to till the ground from which he was taken. And he drove the man out, and he placed cherubim at the east of the Garden of Eden, and the flaming sword which turned every way to guard the way of the tree of life. So this points out the separation from Yah, and also that man at this point had chosen death and was spiritually dead, according to what we've looked at, right? So this tree of life now, would it provide physical or spiritual life? Is it the tree of physical life or the tree of spiritual life? I'm not clear on that. I don't really know. If it's the tree of physical life, then man in his carnal state, eating from it, living forever in that carnal state, may be a dangerous thing. If it's spiritual life, then it would, to me, be a shortcut or another way to spiritual eternity other than what the Father had prescribed, right? And it would also not be a good thing.
Yeah, it seems to me that if it provides eternal spiritual life, it's manipulation or like you said, a shortcut, a way of going around the actual act of being, but take the work of being spiritually connected to the Father. You can just automatically have it if you just choose to eat that fruit every day or whatever.
Right, and so that would mean there was another way to salvation besides the one he prescribed. Right, so he can't allow them to eat from that tree. Either way. So now there's one more point here. The next section is by man came the resurrection. Now this one has a lot of verses in Scripture, so if you guys want to call it a day for this study, we can pick up on it next week. Because there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, just 11 different areas in Scripture to look at regarding this one section. And it's going to take a little time. So I'm okay either way. I just don't want to suck up the whole day with you guys because I know you have other things to do and we have other things to talk about.
Hey, Michael.
Yes, sir.
Genesis 3:22.
Okay.
Very interesting thought. Now they were in the Garden of Eden, correct? Before he partook of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, behold, the man has become as one of us, to know good and evil. And now lest he put forth his hand, take also of the tree of life, and eat and live forever. So evidently, Adam was eating of the tree of life. But the one he wasn't supposed to eat, he did, which is knowledge of tree of good and evil. So he had access to the tree of life and was giving him life. It was in the garden. This is kind of something to think about.
That's what I've always thought, Niels, is that he was eating from that tree, the tree of eternal life.
But he couldn't go back to that tree because he ate of the wrong tree, which gave him good and evil, and became like the Elohim.
And
right.
it was a blessing that the Father made them.
You're out of here. Yeah.
So here's
I was thinking about the different trees and what they meant and why they were forbidden and why they weren't forbidden, and talking about spiritual death and physical death and so on. So I thought, well, what about the tree of life? The tree of life gave them life. The spiritual aspect or the physical aspect? So I went back and looked it up.
My opinion is that the tree of life, is spiritual. I'm not saying it wasn't a real tree, but I'm saying that the life that came from that tree was
It had to be.
Yeah.
It had to be spiritual because that's what makes you live forever. And only Elohim has life immortal.
Yeah. So I agree.
So you are saying that it was some kind of a shortcut to
and their eyes weren't
spirituality.
Their eyes were not open yet until they partook of the one they weren't supposed to, the knowledge of good and evil, not the tree of life.
I'm not, Kelly, I have to address your question. I'm not saying that it was a shortcut before they sinned. Because as long as they were in good standings with the Father, they had permission to eat from that tree. But as soon as sin entered, as soon as they decided to disobey him, they were cut off, right? Kicked out. Done. You can't eat from it anymore because now we're not in good standing. Now you have to be redeemed to me first before you can have that promise, right? And that's why at that point we needed to be redeemed, which we now have been. Hallelujah.
Yeah, because I've always heard that it was physical life that it was referring to, and that it was a blessing that the Father made them leave the garden, because then they would have continued eating from that tree and have lived eternally in their sinful or fallen state.
I've heard that too, and I'll tell you now, after examining this stuff with this new thing in mind, I don't believe that the death of Adam was physical. I don't believe that I'm not concrete on any of this stuff because I don't want to be, because I want the Father to be able to mold me into whatever he wants me to see. But currently, it's very plausible for me, and I believe that if the death of Adam is a spiritual death, and that's mentioned in chapter 3 of Bereshit or Genesis, and there's also life mentioned in the same chapter, then they have to be the same kind of life and death. They can't flip-flop in the same sentence about what type of life and what type of death is. I don't think that's point. I don't think that that's very logical. So, and I know logic is not, I don't mean reason and logic, but I mean it doesn't make much sense. So anyhow, the rest of I've got 1.5 pages left of notes for the rest of this section up to the timing of the resurrection, but it's already after 12.
1.
Right, after 1 in your area.
Here on the East Coast.
So I'm gonna go ahead and dog it off right there. So you guys can discuss things and we can talk and have other stuff. That way I'm not eating up the whole day. But thank you everybody for being here. And I'm sorry that I didn't get anybody else to read. I just wanted to try to go through a lot, and I had all the notes here. So thank you guys.